In our time, Saint Thérèse is known as a Doctor of the Church, a title officially bestowed on her by Pope John Paul II in 1998. She is a doctor in the Latin sense of the word, from docere, to teach. A document from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops states that for a saint to be declared a doctor of the Church, this means that the whole body of their work, taken together, serves to advance the cause of Christ and his Church. Even prior to this official pronunciation, Day, like many others, had a sense that Thérèse had something to teach the Church, and that her life's work offered a new way of hewing to the gospel. Thérèse did in fact have some opportunities to teach during her lifetime. In her correspondence with her sister Leonie, who did not successfully enter religious life until after Thérèse's death, she's gentle and encouraging, seeing and tending in her older sister a calling that others overlooked. I am interiorly persuaded that you are in your vocation, not only as a visitation nun, but as a can visitantin, Thérèse wrote to Leonie in 1895. Leonie had been disappointed in her superior's decision to delay her religious profession, but Thérèse trusted in God's providence for her beloved sister. From her youth, Thérèse provided informal spiritual direction for Leonie, making her the first disciple of the Little Way. At Carmel, a new prioress was elected at the conclusion of Mother Marie de Gonzag's term, and the former prioress was appointed novice mistress. This position was more a nod to her aristocratic background, and was not in truth a good fit for Mother Marie's temperament. To discreetly account for her limitations and to allow her to save face, Thérèse was appointed as assistant novice mistress and was given charge of the formation of postulants. Thérèse's first class included her sister Céline and her cousin Marie, and the new sisters blossomed under her instruction. Thérèse's teaching, however, extended beyond any formal or informal formation she gave while she was alive. It is in her embrace of suffering and her abandon to God's mercy that moved Day to labor over a re-presentation of Thérèse's life for the post-war era. Thérèse discovered the first signs of the tuberculosis that would eventually kill her in April of 1896. Thérèse had suspected from her youth that she would die early, and she rejoiced seeing the blood in her handkerchief, knowing that it meant that she would soon be home with God. Even as her illness worsened, Thérèse desired to continue with the physically demanding penances of life at Carmel, and the prioress permitted it, likely not aware of exactly how sick Thérèse really was. The sisters had enough food at the convent, but not enough heat, and Thérèse suffered deeply from the cold. Normandy winters are cold and damp, the penetrating cold of a New England, as contrasted with the dry cold of Minnesota, Day writes. Anyone who has ever suffered the desolation of cold can realize what the little flower had to endure. On her insistence, those last days of her life, the convent was heated after her death. A criticism that is sometimes lobbed at both Day and Thérèse is that in their closeness to sickness and poverty, they somehow glorified these things. Day, like Thérèse, understood suffering to be inevitable, but refused to see it as a good thing, or as God's will, or as some just punishment for sin. No, Day writes, Thérèse, the realist, well knew that suffering of body and soul is not lofty and exalted, but mean and cruel, a reflection of the blackness of hell. It was not suffering for itself that she embraced. It was a means to an end, the very means used by Jesus himself. The American post-war ethos embraced technological progress as a panacea for social suffering, preferring cultural narratives of exceptionalism and growing prosperity to an honest look at the losses of 2 world wars, a global pandemic and economic depression, and the continuing legacies of racism and dispossession that had from the onset excluded so many from participation in the new American dream. These narratives shielded many comfortable Americans from the nagging anxieties of the new era, but they did not fully eradicate those fears. For the excluded and dispossessed, refusal to acknowledge pain and grief was never an option. Day, like Thérèse, understood that suffering was better accepted than ignored. The new society could only be built in the shell of the old once we accepted and mourned that the world we knew was only a dry husk that had never offered shelter to many of our sisters and brothers. Thérèse also suffered internally, and this was completely hidden until her writings were read after her death. Her long periods of depression and spiritual dryness continued throughout her life, in spite of her lasting conviction that God had called her to exactly where she was. Reflecting on this, Day writes, "When I copy down these written words of Thérèse about the blackness of her night, I realize them more and more clearly, and see them more clearly too, her great love and great desire for all men. She prays for all men with that holy optimism of Charles Péguy in his great poem, God Speaks, where he compares the folded hands of Jesus in the Our Father to the prow of a ship which plows on ahead through the waves, and in its wake draws all along after it. She too cries out for mercy, for all, not just for her family, for France, for Christians, but for all." The shared legacy of both Thérèse and Day is in the inability they leave us with to divide the worthy from the unworthy poor. For Day, that poverty is typically material. For Thérèse, it is spiritual. But in every case, God is for all of us. In the end, this is what Thérèse, Doctor of the Church, offers to her students: the total unimportance of anything in this world except God's love for us. This was the burden of her teaching, Day states. The tuberculosis continued to worsen over the remainder of 1896 and 97. Thérèse was ultimately confined to the infirmary, where only a few years before she had been a nurse. After an agonizing illness, Thérèse died on the evening of September 30th, 1897. Day writes that in her last moments, Thérèse had offered herself a victim of love rather than justice, offering herself on behalf of all of those who rejected Christ's love, dying with a final declaration of God and love for God on her lips. 39 days later, on the other side of the ocean, the student who would ultimately grasp the range of Thérèse's message, the social significance of the little way, was born in Brooklyn, New York, another ordinary child in an ordinary family, whom God had called and chosen for holiness, as he calls and chooses us all.